Hi there, I'm Terry Lynn. Welcome to Jim's second video, The Mysterious Juicy Wash Demystified. When Jim figured this out, it was without a doubt like letting a lion out of the cage. Before this, it was said that you might tackle the juicy wash in 20 years or never figure it out at all. Frankly, Jim thought that was drastically overstated, so he activated his scientific mindset. Through his research, 20 years has now been chopped down to 20 minutes. It all has to do with surface tension, which you'll see in microscopic action. I feel certain you'll understand the process after watching the Juicy Wash Being Demystified video. By the way, before I forget, there's a really good demonstration near the end of the video, so don't miss it. He feels all his videos should be free and available to everyone. So he's asking you to let other watercolor painters you might know about the Juicy Wash video and the other two videos in this series. This will help a lot of watercolor painters. Okay, onward to tame the juicy wash. Ciao.
In this second video, The Mysterious Juicy Wash Demystified, you'll learn how to mix and judge water to paint ratios and then properly apply them to paper. Once you've grasped this procedure, we'll work together on some exercises and techniques that will help you to create more visually engaging paintings. I'll end up with a figurative demonstration to illustrate the principles we've covered. I'm certain you'll enjoy the experience of learning to float in color while also discovering the ability to finally control your washes predictably. Now, we've probably all watched highly regarded watercolor painters apply an unorthodox color combination and get away with it. Results might have been even better had they chosen a luminous color combination, but some dubious mixtures can work simply because the artist employs a proper water to paint ratio. Now, in general, I believe it's important to choose luminous color combinations, but learning proper water to paint formulas and techniques adds a new dimension to your painting skills and will allow you to occasionally pull off questionable color combinations as well. Well, let's get started up in the studio. I inadvertently became a transparent watercolor purist. Primarily, I follow that direction in my work because it allows me to create watercolor paintings that are truly radiant or luminous. I defined luminosity in the first video, but it's worth repeating. When watercolor pigments are properly applied to well-sized paper, light passes and refracts through them, then through the transparent external sizing layer, reflects off of the white paper and returns through the external sizing and the crystalline pigment particles, illuminating them like stained glass. This glowing stained glass effect is what we call luminosity. Ideally, luminosity is what transparent watercolors should be striving for, but to keep life interesting, several factors can adversely affect luminosity and must be considered throughout the painting process. For instance, improper color combinations can look dull because light bounces off the pigment rather than the paper. Yet, if you choose the right color combinations, but then don't suspend them properly, you can also defeat your efforts. Too much brushwork, or even the wrong brush used with too much pressure, will drive color into the paper, again defeating luminosity. The fibers on the surface of the paper become saturated with color and can no longer efficiently reflect light. Now, once luminosity is reduced in any of these ways, the washes look flat and lifeless. Undoubtedly, some of these concerns sound familiar. Resolving them might seem a little overwhelming right now, but once you've studied the instructions and completed the exercises in this video series, you'll have the solutions and the skills to avoid these common problems. Remember, I'm assuming you already know how to select the right color combinations from working with the first video. So now, let's learn how to properly suspend colors with appropriate water to paint ratios and then apply those washes to paper. We'll tackle the techniques of brushwork in the third video. Most painters find it difficult to produce highly saturated washes that remain luminous and interesting when dry. Actually, it's an easy wash to create once you understand water to paint ratios. I think that when you see the following demonstration, you'll realize why I say this. Surface tension is one of the most important indicators we have to identify successful water-to-paint ratios. Now, you've experienced surface tension when you accidentally filled a glass above its rim and then didn't dare move it without first sipping a little. It's really not necessary to know what creates this phenomenon, but it probably can't hurt. This demonstration will help you to identify surface tension as well as water-to-paint ratios. Now, this is a crucial lesson toward understanding and handling water-to-paint ratios, so please watch the demonstration and then get your paints out and give it a try. I'll begin with a small puddle of water on a clean butcher's tray.
When air comes into contact with a water surface, the water molecules flock to the center of the surface, causing them to create a near spherical shape. I won't get into why it's spherical, that's a little too involved. Just remember this shape. You'll see it in a moment when I show you the first experiment. My puddles will be quite small, only about ½ an inch in size. This smaller scale gives you a better appreciation for what I'm referring to when I speak of surface tension. Make your puddles larger if you prefer. It's certainly a little easier to control. I'll maintain the puddle on the left as it is. It'll provide a means of comparison as the puddle on the right lowers and rises as the experiment progresses. The brush I'm using is a number 6 Kolinsky round. With a thirsty brush, I'll bring some cadmium red to the puddle on the right and discharge it. Watch carefully and you'll notice how the color instantly flows into the water when I touch the tip of the brush to the crest of the dome. I need to pump the brush up and down to mix the paint loaded in the brush with the water in the dome. I'll try not to spread the puddle as I'm doing this. As I add more color, I'm breaking down the surface tension of the water by breaking the molecular links. It's kind of like tossing some sawdust into a puddle of water to make it flatten. Using a backlight is the best way to view the dramatic dome effect. You can see that the puddle is collapsing. At this point, it's gone beyond what I'd consider a useful transparent watercolor suspension, but just to be certain the lesson is clear, I'll bring the puddle down to basement level. Before I load the brush for a small example of this mixture, I'll wash out the brush and make it thirsty. I'll be referring to a thirsty brush occasionally. You can prepare a thirsty brush by washing it out, then dragging the hairs across a damp sponge a few times, removing most of the wetness. As I apply this color, you can see that it has an opaque quality to it. Once dried, there's no evidence of light bouncing back from the paper. The transparency is lost. Now I'll add water to this pancake to recreate the domed effect. The most concentrated, properly suspended wash will evolve just before the puddle begins to collapse. So regenerating backwards, which it had surface tension should be easy. The one I'm working with can't become as spherical as the one on the left, since there's paint suspended in it, but it should certainly be apparent when it has recovered surface tension. This should be about right. Let's try painting an example at this stage. Notice how it appears fairly dark and opaque. This isn't surprising since there's a lot of body to this application. This is how I describe a juicy wash. Surface tension needs to be at work. Look at the dried example. It displays luminosity and is just about as dark in value as it can be and still allow light to reflect from the paper. This is what we should expect from our darkest statements. I don't feel we should push them to create values they're not capable of generating if in the process we sacrifice luminosity. Now we'll try a lighter valued stage. I find that to make any significant change, I need to nearly double the amount of water from one example to the next. By the way, this method of adding water to the paint is the most logical method of liquefying our paint mixtures. We place paint on a mixing tray and then suspend them properly with water until we generate the desired value. You can probably see this quite well on your television screen, but it's only after conducting this experiment that you'll really have a feel and understanding for what's happening when you suspend your paints with water. Aside from your basic painting equipment, you'll need a slick surface, a decent small brush, and a cadmium color. I think learning the importance of suspending colors and appreciating that they indeed appear more interesting is something we can grasp immediately. What might throw you off at first is determining the color's value when properly suspended. What seems to be a dark mixture may end up being light. As this experiment progresses, notice how much water is added to make a difference in value from one stage to the next. During the next segment, I'll show you what we're looking for when we mix our colors on a mixing tray and then spread out the mixture to determine the value of our wash. Generally speaking, if the mixture looks so dark in value that it looks wrong, it'll probably be just right. It's not unusual to find properly suspended washes drying 40 to 50% lighter than they appear wet. Remember, just because we refer to some colors as opaque doesn't mean they're meant to be used that way. They are transparent watercolors, and that's how they're best applied and viewed, in a transparent manner. I bet you're concerned that the large puddle will consume the smaller one, right? Well, I am too. I'm just going to get it over with. We must learn to identify and control surface tension while suspending water with our paints. It's the most reliable criteria we have for determining if our water to paint ratio is suitable. And if we're going to manage luminosity effectively, it's imperative. This is the last stage, although I could probably keep going for another 5 or 6 steps until we only had a blush of color. What's important to observe is that the color still has character. The pigment has settled attractively on the paper and is vibrant and interesting. I keep my paints moist so they're moderately liquefied when brought to the mixing tray. I prefer to have moist paint available rather than having to lather it to get the brush charged. To create a mid-valued blue, I'll need to drop in several brush loads of water. When I judge the mixture to be about right, I find it's easiest to check the value by spreading it out on the mixing tray. Don't try to extend the charge in the brush any further than it's capable. Scrubbing it on the paper is counterproductive. Just pick up another load. This second application assures me there's plenty of suspension to create a juicy wash. It's important to exert very little brush pressure. Using a good Kolinsky sable will also help. To create a blossom, I'll need a much higher ratio of water to paint than there is on the paper. The interesting thing is that this is a suspension that many watercolor painters make and use, which often leads to undesired results, like we'll see in a moment. Here you can see that the water ratio is high. By dropping the tip of the brush in the mixture, I can test its viscosity. Notice how quickly the puddle fills back in. As I drop in the mixture, you can see that it immediately dispels the French ultramarine blue. The blue is flash flooded ahead of the surge of the watery quinacridone gold. As it dries, veins will develop around its perimeter. This is often referred to as spidering. Here's the dried result. I'll skip showing you the application of French ultramarine on the paper again. Here you can see that the paper is very wet. In a minute or so, there's more sheen, but it's still a little too wet to begin. By the time I get this quinacridone gold prepared, it should be ready. Remember, Our objective this time is to avoid a blossom. Notice how the color has a thicker viscosity this time. When I dab the tip of the brush into the tray mixture, the puddle is slower to fill back in. By this time, the paper should have a proper sheen, and this should blend in fairly well. You can see that this water to paint ratio doesn't have the same tendency to dispel the French ultramarine as it's dropped in. As it dries, the colors seem to mingle rather than separate. Once dried, it's not surprising that it's much lighter, but the colors have mingled even more. I like this, it has character. Now you know how to prevent a blossom, you also know how to produce it. Use it creatively sometime. I'll begin by creating a pasty violet using cobalt blue and vermilion and then add water. By the way, don't clean out your brush before picking up water. There's no sense in wasting the paint. Notice the dome effect along the top edge of the puddle. Once I have it liquefied, I'll scoop up a good charge before applying it to the paper. You can see that although it seems dense as a thick puddle with this much surface tension, it reveals more of what I might expect on paper once I see it spread out on the tray. After applying this violet wash, I'll follow up with a second, but let's skip ahead. I'm going to float in cobalt blue. It doesn't happen often, but once in a while a little chunk of wayward color needs to be squashed and mixed in. Just shove that little critter aside. While dropping in the color, I sense that the violet wash is a little wetter than I would ideally prefer. If this is the case, I expect this exercise will probably dry lighter. I'll raise the paint ratio slightly for the next color, Permanent Rose, to compensate for the wetter violet wash. Well, here it is dry and it's lighter, but the colors blended well. The paper was at a very slight angle and there's a small blossom at the bottom. Just wanted you to know that perfection is not expected with watercolors. Remember, use the tip of the brush like an eyedropper to tattoo the color into the existing wash. You want paint to discharge from the brush and mingle with the mixture on the paper. If you literally brush the paint into the wash, you'll lose the effect. Now keep your paper flat, or nearly so, and don't accelerate the drying with a hairdryer. Be patient, and if it doesn't work the first time, try it again. Using aureolin and permanent rose, I'll suspend a mixture with enough water for a strong value statement. These are the colors I usually begin with for flesh tones, although not this robustly. Now I'll prepare cobalt blue for floating in. I paid close attention to the sheen of the first wash, and the color seems to be floating in well. If this was a cobalt blue wash being brushed into aureolin and permanent rose mixture, it would blend with a soft edge. This dried example appears successful. You might notice that the slight angle of the paper has caused the colors to collect more heavily at the bottom than they did at the top. The colors throughout the center display a beautiful blend of all the colors, yet retain the character of each. Carry plenty of pigment to the mixing tray with your brush. It's quite common not to use enough pigment. It's also common to have weak washes. Now there's a connection here. Remember to scoop a full charge from the tray puddle with your brush. This time I'm going to apply the paint while the sap green wash is just approaching a sheen, and intentionally create a lighter, more diffused result. There's a decent amount of paint on this round as well. I'm preparing quinacridone burnt orange. The next floated in color is quinacridone gold. The ratio of the water is slightly higher than the quinacridone burnt orange and should create a lighter section in the dried example. Notice how it barely registers its color when floated into the sap green. The last color is cobalt blue. Since this will also be more watery, it should blend into the sap green in the same manner as the quinacridone gold. With the last two colors, there's some additional water being discharged into the base color by the floated in colors. You can see how wet it is by the reflection of the brush's shiny ferrule. Here's the dried combination. It's light as we intended, and the result is useful for many painting statements. It's important to understand that we need quiet passages in our paintings, and the visual variety this technique offers will improve the impact of those passages.
Well, I hope you found floating in color exercises helpful in developing a sense of water and paint proportions. Try a few more combinations of your own design. After that, try spreading out some washes and brush rather than tattoo colors through them. With timing and the right ratios, they'll be much more controlled and engaging than before. Now, a few things popped up during the exercises that I feel need a little more elaboration. One was judging the wetness or sheen of the paper. Another is spidering, since it occurs in two different forms and is not well understood why it develops. The last is judging what the value of a color will be when it's dry by how it appears when wet. Now, no question, we know it'll be lighter, but it seems that the middle and lighter values can throw us off. But more on that in a minute. Let's start by identifying the wetness of the paper. To me, it seems that judging the relative wetness of a wash on paper is fairly simple, since we use sheen as our guide. And as long as we have a source of backlight, what we observe and conclude about the wash's degree of wetness is reasonably constant. Now, the only variable I can think of is the paper you might be using. In my opinion, it's easier to judge cold-pressed and rough paper than it is very smooth hot-pressed paper. Well, let's look at some examples. If it looks wet or glossy, as this does, you should wait. Unfortunately, there's no time formula for how long you should wait, since there are too many environmental considerations as well as variables from one paper manufacturer to another. As it begins to dry, it appears to have a wet sheen, where you can see some of the texture of the paper. It's manageable, yet tending to still be a little watery. Once the wash evaporates to a slight sheen, as you see here, its condition is nearly ideal. Colors will wash or float in successfully. Here the wash is dried a little too long to be controlled. It's lost nearly all of its sheen. Most additional colors will layer on top and not mingle. Well, now the question of spidering. Generally, it's caused by one of two conditions. We've already experienced one of the conditions during the first exercise when we created a blossom. It was caused by adding a color with much too high a water ratio in comparison to the wash on the paper. In that case, the sheen on the paper was at the correct stage. The floated in color was wrong. Here's an example of blossom spider using quinacridone burnt orange and cobalt blue. What's important is it's distinguished by light veins.
Remember, to avoid blossoms, the floated in color must be approximately the same water to paint ratio as the existing wash. The second type of spider is distinguished by veins of the floated in color and is as dark as the value of that color. In other words, the color's strength and value are essentially retained in the veins. These spiders, unlike blossom spiders, are created by adding a color with a correctly gauged ratio of water to paint into a wash that's too wet. To prevent this, float in color when the base wash is glistening a little but clearly not wet. Spiders can also be created if either the first wash or the floated in color contain too little gum arabic. Gum arabic tends to prevent colors from spreading. You'll find that exhausted paint well colors are sapped of gum arabic. I've also found that the very transparent synthetic colors are the strongest candidates to cause spidering if you place them on a wet wash. But what seems to be a problem is really an asset. Now you know how to prevent or induce spidering. Personally, I can see where this could be a beautiful effect in a painting. To be able to produce effects such as this at will is one more step toward mastering this medium. By the way, you can add gum arabic to your colors. There's a chapter in my book that addresses conditioning your paints. Finally, how do we judge for middle or light values of a mixture? Well, if the dome is present, and we know the color in the water mixture is in the ballpark, spread the mixture out a little and look at its relative value as compared to the color's fully saturated state. Here are examples of light, medium, and dark suspensions of the same color. You see the relative difference? All can produce excellent washes when properly applied. After you work with this method of creating juicy washes for a while, you won't need to generate the dome to judge the value of a wash. You'll be able to determine it simply by spreading it out on your mixing tray. Now, if the wash dries without character, yet you feel the water to paint ratio and the value was correct, the problem may have been created by spreading out the wash too thinly on your paper. To correct this, charge the brush fully and apply a thicker, higher domed application. When it evaporates, the pigments will settle naturally, displaying the right value. Keep in mind that this wet application will appear darker in value than you're used to, but when it dries, you'll see that this juicy statement displays much more character. Of course, it'll also dry lighter, too. Now, one last word of advice. Don't rebrush once a wash is settled and drying. For whatever reason, doing this seems to scuttle its character. Well, I'm ready to get started on this demonstration. In actuality, this painting will take 4 to 5 days to complete. I think I'll need to considerably condense time and only select scenes that illustrate germane information. Now, I'll explain as much of the process as I can during this demo, and I'll also be offering tips along the way. Well, let's get started. If you've been to one of my workshops, you already know that I like to begin my paintings with aureolin. If a passage will eventually be comprised of yellow, I'll apply it as an underglaze as I begin the painting. This creates a glow that intensifies a color's luminosity. Here the aureolin is well suspended in lots of water to create a thin first wash. I want a light statement, otherwise the following tendency is to add too much red, trying to balance the overstated yellow. Big mistake. The figure then looks like a cooked lobster. Seeing it's too orange, you'd probably resort to adding blue. Matters go from bad to worse since it then appears grayed and lifeless. In short, it's all over with except for the shouting. The moral of this story is not to use too much yellow in the first wash. I know this is a little off the track, but while I'm laying in this yellow wash, let me share a little info with you. I found that glazing yellow over darker statements is not always successful. Yellows are light in value, and almost all impart a slight white film over the surface of darker statements, even aureolin, which is quite transparent. When I find a passage that's starved for yellow, I use a glaze of quinacridone gold. Its robust yet transparent nature glazes without leaving a haze. It's interesting that quinacridone gold looks relatively dark in a paint well, but with its high tinting strength thins out to a light value, highly transparent warm yellow. Try it the next time you need to pump up the yellow by glazing over a dry statement. I'm painting with aureolin and permanent rose. I created a few variations of the mixture on the painting tray to pull color from. No matter what flesh color I may be describing, I always begin with the same two colors since, at least in my unscientific opinion, it represents the underlying skin tone on anyone. During this first stage of laying in the lightest washes, I'm exploring form and trying to sense the movement around the facial structure as if I were tracking around the contours of the face with my brush. By adding cobalt blue to the mix, I'll create a modified blue-violet with a slightly higher paint-to-water ratio than I've previously been working with. Now I'm adding aureolin to prepare a mid-valued yellow-brown. Before laying down the next wash, I'll test the dryness with the back of my hand. It's just slightly cool to the touch, but not moist. I'll begin working on form by painting the shadowed sides of the larger planes. Here I'm adding some permanent rose to the mixture. To gain continuity, I'll drag some of the pooled color at the V of his collar upwards and release it in an appropriate spot. Now I'll use my easel to twister to make the pool flow back and to the right to create a more interesting dried wash. This easel brings a new dimension to painting in watercolor. Up until now, I've just used a primary triad of aureolin, permanent rose, and cobalt blue. Now I'll work with quinacridone gold and quinacridone burnt orange, combining them with a previous mixture. I always start with the face and other exposed flesh before working on other parts of a figurative painting because I feel if I don't capture the essence of this important part of the painting, there's no sense in having invested time in the rest of the painting. After all, we can all recognize an error in a face, but seldom one in clothing or backgrounds. You certainly don't have to be an artist to recognize errors in rendering a face. This may seem overstated, but it will certainly dry lighter. I think it was Frank Riley who said, "If it looks right when it's wet, it's wrong." It's a great statement. I really agree, but look at it another way. If it looks too dark when it's wet, it's probably right. Before I go too long and the wash dries, I'll return with a damp brush of clear water and let the hairs just drag across the boundary of the wet wash. Since the clear water application is less wet than the existing wash, the color flows into the damp area, creating a soft-edged effect. Try this until you get the hang of it. It's very useful in creating edges that turn. Here I've intensified the quinacridone burnt orange a bit. I'll use this medium value statement to further define the shadow forms on his face.